So why don't we go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, my name is Scott Livingston. I'm with OCLC. I am the Executive Director of Management Services at OCLC. And I have one of those wonderful titles that doesn't actually say much of anything when you start to think about it. So let me introduce myself just briefly and then we'll move on to the rest of the discussion this afternoon. So I'm part of our global product organization. The team I lead is responsible for the tools that libraries use to manage their libraries. So we're responsible for our ILSs globally, including OCLC Wise, which we'll talk about in a few moments. We're responsible for Easy Proxy, our APIs, our mobile platform, all the tools that you're using to deliver services to your libraries. My team has the honor of being able to design and develop for you. And so what I wanted to do this afternoon was share some information about what is both a new product and a very mature product, OCLC Wise. I have the gift of gab. I'm an introvert by heart, but I love to talk, and so I could talk the full hour, but my role here is not to talk to you. My role here is to share information, and I think that usually means we have to have some sort of conversation for that to happen. And so I'm going to pause. I'm going to give ample time for questions. We can explore topics that are of interest to you specifically, and we'll have much more of a discussion than a formal sort of talking head presentation, if that's all right with you. Yeah? Okay. The other thing I just wanted to mention very briefly is we are live streaming. So when we do have questions and dialogue, I will try my best to summarize the question for the folks in the virtual meetings. If I get it wrong, apologies, please correct me, and we'll make sure folks online can participate as much as possible as well. So what I wanted to start with is a bombshell of an announcement. Public libraries are changing. I know this is not news to anyone in this room, and it's not news to us either. But what's interesting, and I think Pam referenced a lot of this in her discussion just a few minutes ago, what's interesting is the way that libraries are changing. The vocabulary you're using, the emphasis you're using, and the sense of focus on community is a really strong theme that we're seeing from public libraries, both in the US and in other countries where we operate as well. This notion of change is pervasive. You are not a building full of books, and you all know this. You do amazing programming. You offer services, training, counseling, all sorts of wonderful things are part of the suite that makes up the public library. The problem, we think, though, is that the tools you have at your disposal have not kept up with you. And so what we wanted to start to talk about was, what would happen if a public library had a set of tools to manage its business that recognized that what you're about is being the heart of your community? What would happen if the tools you had moved beyond managing physical inventories? Were not point solutions. We're fully integrated and started to talk about how you engage with your community. What would happen is something called OCLC Wise. And OCLC Wise is a product that we're introducing into the United States. We launched it about 12 months ago here in the US. We're also starting to roll it out to public libraries globally. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But it's our vision of software that meets the 21st century needs and best practices of public libraries. So when we start thinking about the library, and Pam sort of referenced this in some of hers as well, right? The library is sort of the center square of your community, whether that's literally true and you're on the heart of a downtown area, or whether it's metaphorically true and you're at the heart in your community's mind, you're the center. You're the thing that holds everything together. But how do you do that when your tools are designed around inventory management and book acquisition? You do that by pausing and saying, yes, and. Yes, books are our product. They're one of our products, and they're incredibly important to who we are and what we do. But our tools cannot manage individual parts of what we do. Our tools need to be wholly integrated and reflect the complexity, multifaceted nature of the modern public library. So we have designed something called a community engagement system. And it takes a radically different view on what the software is that libraries use to manage their operations. Traditionally, ILSs, and we'll sort of put ILSs in the camp of tools I use to manage my library, ILSs were designed around the bibliographic record. They were designed around books, and when books started to be accompanied or in some cases replaced by electronic, the metaphor sort of expanded. But it didn't really change. It was about managing a collection of things. And the library is not a collection of things. The library is services and engagement with its community. So OCLC Wise took a different approach. The very first thing it said was, that's not the 21st century library. The 21st century library is about people. So at the heart of the system, we designed the system around the person and the patron record, not around the bibliographic record. It's a radically different concept because what you start to think about is every engagement you have, every touch point you have, how you create personalized experiences, how you measure that experience and deliver that in new and diverse sorts of ways because you know the individuals. Now that's not to say that we don't have the ability to manage physical collections, etc. But we're going to take a few minutes to talk really about what are some of the powerful benefits when the underlying philosophy of the tools you use are about people and not about the physical books. One of the things that becomes really easy really quickly in a system that's designed around people is you start to be able to connect relationships between people. So one of the things that Wise does is that it allows your patrons to articulate the relationships that they want to have with other patrons. Sometimes these are family relationships, parent and children, for example. But these can be much more complex and nuanced relationships if your individual patron wants to do that. And what does that relationship do for your system? It's a great piece of data. It tells you something interesting about a person and their relation to others. But more importantly, it allows them to have a different experience. Because the system, thinking about these as people, starts to grant permissions around things like checking out materials, starts to grant permissions around things like paying fines, registering for programs, and your relationships become the point of the exercise, not the individual activity that they're pursuing. So this idea of designed around people becomes critically important. Now, Wise is an interesting product from a product person's point of view because it is both new and, frankly, quite old. It's about 20 years old at this point. It was first created in the Netherlands by a company called HKA. They joined the OCLC family roughly 10 years ago at this point. And they started their entire premise with designing a library system around people. Today, they have about 75% of all public libraries in the Netherlands using their software. It is solid, stable, and it's the market leader in the Netherlands. Now, I've had the great pleasure of visiting public libraries in the Netherlands many times, and they are incredibly innovative. They are program-oriented, they are community-oriented, they are creative, and they are pushing boundaries in much the same way that Pam was talking about just a few minutes ago. They're not unique. You all are doing the same work, right? And so when we started to look at what was happening in the Netherlands, we thought, there may be an opportunity here to take a really interesting and different concept and bring it to the US, and other countries for that matter. So we spent, roughly 2.5 years talking to public libraries across the US. We have a public library advisory board. We did site visits. Some of my staff worked as unpaid interns in public libraries to actually firsthand experience what you're doing and understand why you're doing it. And we took all that learning and we started to think about what would need to happen to take a Dutch product and bring it to the US. That's what we've been working on over the last several years. Interesting, again, at least from a product person's point of view, during that period, Flanders, which is the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, so about half the country, decided to go for a provincial RFP to cover every public library in the province, so about half the country. It's about 300 public libraries. And they selected OCLC Wise. And they selected it not because it's Dutch, although certainly that helps, I mean, language is important, but they selected it because Flemish libraries were also deeply focused on their role in the community and the impact they had not to the community, but to every individual in that community. And this notion of being focused around the individual, the architecture designed around a person and not a book, really resonated. And so we're in the process right now of moving those 300 libraries from their legacy systems onto OCLC Wise. And at the same time, bringing it into the United States. In the US, we've had a very measured approach to how we're starting to introduce Wise into the US. I mentioned we have a Public Library Advisory Board. We meet officially once a year and then unofficially at conferences and what have you over the remainder of the year. And they have been incredibly helpful in helping us understand the types of challenges that public libraries are facing, not just with their library management system, but more generally. They've been incredibly helpful at helping us think through the value of this type of service, understanding what would need to be done, and they provided incredible counsel and guidance. We have also continued to engage with individual libraries as well, going out to meet them, watching what they're doing, talking to their staff, and that's informing our strategy. But in some respects, almost more critical than all of that are the OCLC Wise early adopters in the US. When we began to take the product into the US, we understood that there were going to be development needs necessary for it to work in America. Our library ecosystem in the States is significantly more rich and robust than it is in the Netherlands. The types of systems that you need to connect to, the way that you purchase your materials, the types of programming that you offer is much more varied and much more nuanced in some respects than what the Dutch had originally envisioned. And so we work with our early adopters. We design wireframes, prototypes, betas, and introduce that to that group as a collective. And they help refine and adjust our thinking as we're continuing to build out the functionality over the next several years. Now again, Wise was built more than 20 years ago. It's operating in hundreds of libraries globally today. It is fully robust and fully functional. But every country has some specific needs, and we're going to continue to address those as we move forward. We're very pleased that there are 5 early adopters who have already signed contracts to have OCLC Wise be their next generation library system. This group meets on a weekly basis where they talk about everything from how they're migrating their data to the functionality that they want to the challenges they're working on collectively as libraries. They're building a community amongst themselves beyond just a software platform. And these 5 in particular have been very interested in engaging with OCLC around innovation, risk-taking, and creativity. We understand that we're all learning and growing, that the world continues to change and evolve, and there's an agreement that we will all grow and develop together. Sometimes that means bumps, sometimes that means misunderstandings, but we always pause and come back together and work our way through those things. And this group of 5 has been incredibly powerful in helping drive the direction of OCLC Wise as it enters the US marketplace. So let me just quickly show you.
In GCPL, we're very much a library that is outward focused. We want to be embedded in the community. And I think that's really the trend of the future, is that the library is not just a building, but the library is everywhere in the community. Historically, libraries have tended to have the idea of, we will give you what we think is good for you. And I don't think that model works anymore. Instead, we want to be able to say, you tell us what you need or what are the problems you're trying to solve, and then we'll say, here's some tools, here's some services, here's some programs that will help you solve that problem.
One of the things that is one of our aspirational goals is to be the town square, the center of the town, so to speak. And Wise is perfect for helping us think about ways that we can actually connect with our customers that we can't today. Our community, like many communities, is growing rapidly and changing rapidly. And this community engagement system gives us an opportunity to evolve and change with our community.
In looking at the product, there were some things that surprised us because we hadn't necessarily looked at ILS from a customer-centric point of view, right? We've looked at the ILS as a tool to help us manage the collection and circulation, as opposed to a tool that can help us connect with our customers in different ways in terms of through electronic communication, through marketing, all of that. And so that was more of an aha for us in terms of thinking about the ILS differently, not just as our tool that we use to sort of organize and manage the books, but looking at it as a tool to help us think about the customer and their needs and how we serve the customer more directly.
This is the only system that really has the customer as the center from the beginning. And that resonated with me, that resonated with the philosophy and with the culture that we have at the Gwinnett County Public Library, because we want to put the customer first. And we think that this is a way to enhance service, to enhance our program, and frankly to raise awareness in the community about what we're doing by having a better means of communicating what we're doing to the public.
It seemed that Wise was going in the same direction that we were going in, paying attention to the many needs of the customers and not focusing on the stuff, the collections that we have in the library. But if you anticipate the services that are needed by your customers, then you can design the services with the customer in mind. We think that Wise will help us better connect with our customers. The architecture of the product will help us integrate ourselves better into the community. I'm very excited about the Wise product and think it offers a new door for libraries, a new opportunity that we haven't really had before to interact and engage with our community.
It's the first chance we have had or we've seen in an ILS system, so to speak, that actually captures our imagination, and it gives us opportunities to actually dream of future possibilities to work more efficiently and to be able to connect with our community.
So that's a great video from some of our early adopters explaining what was so compelling to them about OCLC Wise. The thing that piece leaves out that I personally find most fascinating is not a single one of the early adopter libraries came to OCLC and said, hey, we're interested in a new ILS. Not a one. They had no desire to change ILS systems. But they saw an opportunity to have a library management tool, a community engagement tool, that could aid their overall mission and move them forward in a way that an ILS couldn't. And so the 5 early adopters have been incredibly helpful and powerful in terms of giving us guidance and direction, as I mentioned before. Now, this is a great chart. It's quite small if you're sitting in the back, and I promise I will not read every single row here, but I wanted to talk briefly about what a community engagement system actually entails, because it's an interesting piece of language that is relatively new in our market, in our industry, and often can create some confusion for folks who aren't quite familiar with the term yet. So a community engagement system, first and foremost, designed around your patron. Not the book, designed around your patron. That doesn't mean that the books, your electronic resources, managing circulation, all of that is still important. It doesn't mean that doesn't matter anymore. It's a yes and sort of approach. So OCLC Wise includes all the core components that you might think of from an ILS point of view. Circulation, acquisitions, analytics, and reporting. Absolutely. You need that just to run the building itself, right? On top of that, it brings in other capabilities that are useful for running library systems, supporting events, PC management capabilities. Again, the broader scope of not just the items on the shelf, but really the things that you're doing in the building and outside of the building. On top of that, it includes tools that allow you to understand how your patrons are using the services you're providing. And technologies that allow you to provide a more custom and tailored experience based on the unique things that those individuals are consuming, should they want you to be able to provide that sort of interaction with them. We'll talk about that in just a few moments in a bit more detail. But it takes the concept of an ILS and yes, ands, but first and always around the person. So one of the pieces that's most fascinating to me is the collection management capabilities. Many is a relative term, right? So we won't provide judgment. There are several tools available to libraries to help them manage their collections. And they are all fine and good tools, but what's interesting about Wise, the approach that Wise takes, is it continues to think about the person, not the collection, when it thinks about collection management. Yes, it absolutely can do things like notify staff when an item has circulated over X number of times because it may be damaged and you want to physically review it to determine if you need to reorder it. Absolutely can do that. Absolutely can notify you if an item hasn't circulated over some period of time and you may want to deaccession. Absolutely can do that. But the power is the recommendations it makes about how your collections are being consumed by your community at the local branch. It can start to make recommendations such as, in branch A, 90% of your gardening collection is always in circulation. In branch B, it's only 20%. Do you want to rebalance that collection a little bit to be more mindful of how a local community with its own branch is using your materials? It can make recommendations about a number of items in a particular topic, right? Do you know that your historical fiction collection is always off the shelf? You may want to just expand through acquisition, right? It thinks about how to make a recommendation about the mix of materials at the branch to meet the needs of that branch's local community as expressed by their consumption of your materials. Now, you can make choices any way you want to. It's not going to start to physically move the books around on you, but it's going to make recommendations so that you have data to inform the decisions you're making about how your branch and how your entire system is organized and operates, because it's built around the person. It also looks at the individual as a human being. Now, there are many folks who are very rightly concerned about privacy, about intrusion, about transparency and control over their data. So it allows your patrons to opt into these personalized features. It also allows you some control about whether or not you even want to offer that. So both library and patron have some control over how much and what happens with personal information. But it allows an individual to say, you know what? I don't want a one-size-fits-all approach to how my library communicates with me. I am a human being, and I'm a unique human being with specific needs and interests. And if you could talk to me like that, I would be much more likely to engage with your services. Just a very quick example is to sort of illustrate that point. For reasons that I can barely remember at this point, I have a law degree, and I have a law degree in taxation. And one of the very unfortunate side effects of that sort of educational background is I actually enjoy preparing income taxes. And so every year at tax season, one of my happiest Saturdays is to sit down at the kitchen table with a computer and stacks of papers and file my taxes until my heart's content. Even occasionally getting out a calculator and doing longhand division just because why not? My public library every single year sends me a very lovely notification that tax services are available at the public library. And that's fantastic. I wholly support that. I think it's critical, particularly for certain populations, to be able to take advantage of those kinds of services. It's completely wasted on me. And I don't read it. And it's gotten to the point that every time I see that as one of the main headlines in the newsletter, I delete the entire newsletter because I already know it's not talking to me. What if it could have a different conversation with me? What if it could say, Scott, we see that for a gentleman of your age, you check out an enormous number of toddler reader books. What's going on with you, right? What if it could say to me, oh, by the way, the new Harry Potter's out. Oh, by the way, the PJ Masks book that your kid keeps asking about is out. What if it could create a much more customized experience? It allows me as an individual to select the topics that are important to me. And I get notified when new events occur that are tied to those topics, when new materials enter the library's collections that are tied to those topics. And then things like tax preparation services, which are not important to me individually, are not part of the communication to me. It's a really interesting, powerful metaphor because it's talking about how you talk to me as a human being. Now, I can already imagine, I certainly went through this exercise myself. Well, hold on. It may be really important that he does know about tax preparation services. Maybe he wouldn't consume that, but maybe he would tell somebody about that. Or maybe it's just important for us, for our whole community, to know that we offer these kinds of programs. You absolutely can do that as well. So it's not restricting your abilities, it's allowing for a much more tailored and unique conversation. Ticketing is another great example, right? Pam said today, and I thought this was so interesting, books are our product. They're probably one of several products public libraries have, right? But this idea that books are not the defining metaphor for libraries, I think is such an interesting concept because we all know it's true, and yet we all fall back to the book library metaphor. Ticketing and events is one of the best ways for libraries to engage with your communities. And again, that's not news to any of you. But what if, in addition to knowing that I am always checking out PJ Masks books in my public library, it knew that my kids went to story time every week? What sort of dialogue would you have with me about the kinds of other programming I might be interested in, knowing that I take my children to story time every week and I check out these kinds of materials? Really kind of interesting. And so the patron record, again, remember, around the person, looks not just at my circulation histories, not just at stated preferences of topics, but looks at the ways that I'm engaging with the library through things like events. And adds that into the profile. And I'll explain in just a minute why that is such a powerful concept. And so don't forget that. But it looks at not just the materials, but the events themselves. As I said, I can create topics I'm interested in. I can subscribe to communications based on new additions to the collection related to those topics. And the library can engage with me in, for example, email messaging. That's fantastic. But what if the library could then think, serendipity is a good thing. And maybe he doesn't know some of the things we're doing, but because of what he does know about us, he might be interested. We see he's a parent. We see he checks out these materials. We see he's active in his child's education. I wonder what his area of interest would be around nutrition, childhood nutrition. Not an expressed interest, but actually I'm really kind of very keen on that topic. And you're creating an event at the library around childhood nutrition. What if you could find me and invite me just because I take my child to story time every week and I check out children's books for them? That is really interesting. And so one of the real powers of having all those activities about a person tied to their record is that you can start to create very tailored and custom communications to share information with people that they may not even know they have an interest in yet, but you do because you understand the relationships of your programming to the services you're offering. OCLC Wise has something called the Marketing Workbench, which allows you as a library to create an email marketing campaign to promote an event, to promote new collections in the library, to promote new relationships in your community, whatever it is you want to promote. It allows you to create a campaign. And it allows you to start with who would be most likely to be interested in this. It may be someone, in this particular example, age 18 to 120. Now, that's a very large demographic, and you may not have a lot of 120-year-olds in your community, or maybe you do, but it allows you to do things like age-based targeting. That sounds like a very hot buzzword, and I'm going to put a pause in that for just a second after we work through this. It allows me to do things like, which branch do they visit? Which do they think is their home branch? Which may be the main branch, it may be one of the regional branches. What have they expressed an interest in knowing about from us? Maybe they have expressed, remember that profile we saw earlier, maybe they expressed an interest in technology, or maybe they've expressed an interest in genetics, what have you. What have they expressed an interest in? And what have they consumed from us in the past? And it goes through your patron database and looks for matches on all those criteria and creates that as a distribution list for an email message that you craft, you control, and you distribute. Now, again, patrons have to opt in to receive this sort of custom communication, so they have full control over what the library knows and doesn't know about them. The list is also anonymous, so no library staff ever see the names or email addresses or any other identifiable information about the people receiving that communication. Deep respect for privacy and control. But you start to have great power for people who do want to participate in that sort of relationship to communicate new things that they didn't realize the library was doing, but might resonate with them as individual human beings. Now, as I said, I wanted to put a pin in the age-based thing as well, because that's another one of those very rightly sensitive areas, right? Parents control profiles for their children, so there's no risk of inappropriate communication with minors, as an example. Libraries have significant control over the criteria used when patron records are established. So there's a lot of safeties built into this so that harmful or risky sorts of targeting are reduced or eliminated within the system. So I just wanted to make sure we called that out as well. So the other component is the recommendation engines. As I said, the system can make recommendations around the mix of collections at the branch level, at the shelf level. It can make recommendations about types of people who should be invited to programming. And it provides you data. The most important part is the data. The data tables are incredibly robust. Incredibly robust. A little terrifying sometimes. If you're the kinds of folks who like MySQL queries, this is going to make you happy because you have enormous power and control over the data sets. But they're also, again, privacy by design. So administrator rights limit access to that information. A lot of controls and protections built into this because around the person is powerful. But there are also risks. And so we want to be very mindful of how we mitigate and manage those risks.
Evolving with the community. Building strong relationships. Meeting the right needs, and having impact where it matters most. That's a wise library. Your library has evolved, but what about your systems? OCLC Wise is designed around people, not the collection. With Wise, you know exactly how your community uses your library, and you can make data-driven decisions that create a collection, programs, and spaces your customers will love. Being customer-centric is part of your mission. That's why Wise lets you target information specific to interests, automate email programs to support ongoing engagement, and thrive with community-focused collection development. And Wise brings together many tools you're already using, like marketing management, program registration, ILS functions, discovery and reporting, into one holistic system that's driven by data. Wise libraries transform to meet unique local needs. They transform people's lives, and they transform communities. Are you ready to be a Wise library?
So I love that video because it does in 30 seconds what I've been trying to do for the last half hour, and our marketing team is so much more talented at this than I am. But it really does start to explain the interesting way that this becomes a tool to further libraries' missions around being the heart of the community, around engaging with individuals, human beings. That's what the public library has always been about, and the tools have not kept up with you. We think OCLC Wise does and will, and we're very pleased to begin to introduce it here. We're also introducing it in Germany, working with some early adopters in Germany as well, and we'll continue to look for opportunities to bring it to public libraries in other countries beyond the US and Western Europe. So with that, I would like to pause because I think that's probably a lot of information. I suspect there may be at least one or two questions about some of that. So let me go ahead and see sort of what questions, observations, reservations you all might have. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
So how would this fit with what you just embarked on? Are they compatible system or are they really different system that operates
That's a wonderful question. And for the folks on the live stream, let me just paraphrase that quickly. So I think as many of our members are aware, we have a library management system for academic libraries called World Share Management Services, or WMS. Library Archives Canada elected to subscribe to WMS about a year or so ago now, I think it was. I think you went live about a year. Well, anyway, recently. And the question was, okay, that's great for academics, but sometimes academic libraries and public libraries share patrons. Sometimes they share programs. Occasionally, they like to collaborate with one another. And how does WISE work with WMS? And today, they are two different systems designed to serve the different needs of academic and public libraries. But there are many connection points that we're building between those two systems. One of them is around resource sharing. As we talk to consortia and groups that have both public and academic libraries, one of the main things that tends to happen in those groups that we're understanding from these conversations is the desire to share materials back and forth. So resource sharing is going to be one of the first connection points that brings those systems together. The second connection point is going to focus on data and analytics. So I'm a group administrator in a group with both publics and academics. How do I get a holistic view of everything happening for my member libraries in that group? Analytics is the second layer and connection point that will start to bring those systems in closer proximity to one another. And then the third will be looking at ways to bring the patron closer together. How do I acknowledge that a student at a university is also a patron in my public library? How do I acknowledge, respect, and understand that's a person, not two patron records? And we're looking at ways to start to bring the patron more closely together within those systems. But they will always be separate systems designed for separate types of libraries. Does that help? Yeah. What other questions could I answer? Yes, ma'am.
What are the plans to analyze and share what you're going to learn about these patron profiles from a huge data set? So parents who are taking their kids to these programs and doing whatever, we find in general check out fewer adult material, fewer print adult materials, but more video material. Like there's a lot of power and a lot of information there. What is going to happen to it? How could it be used for good?
Yep. Great question. Again, for the folks on the live stream, you're collecting all this great information about what people are consuming from the library. That's wonderful. That can be very powerful. How are you stewarding that data? Is that a fair?
No, I mean, I trust you to be good guys.
Yeah.
I want to know, like, can you then repackage it and share it back to members to help them learn? Like, we have a small population in this profile, so we don't pay a lot of attention to them. But if you guys do it better, we'd love to know what you're learning.
Perfect. Yeah. So more of a how can we, are we intending to do analytics on the collective and bring that positive learning back to libraries who are using the system so that they can, yes, perfect. Thank you. Today, no. We don't have an intention to do that. As I said, we take a privacy by design approach. We have a data privacy officer who is part of the OCLC staff, and we're very thoughtful about, even in aggregate anonymized data sets, how much we as OCLC are actively looking at that data. Now, As we continue to talk to libraries, we may find that there's a broad-based interest in us starting to do some data mining and exploration, again, in aggregate and anonymized to help inform your own programming. If you all permission us, we could certainly start to look there, but we're taking a very conservative approach right now. Yeah. Yes, please.
So I know there's some other collection management tools like CollectionHQ, for example, that is looking at how they can integrate with something like an automated materials handling system and use that intelligence and analytics to make some of those decisions about where things go and where they be most likely useful automatically without a human intervention on each and every task there. Is there any talk about that with Wise or?
Yes, so right now it looks at circulation behavior itself. So the actual transactions being processed through the system, and that's what's powering the collection recommendations. Certainly on our roadmap, we're looking at automated handlers as part of an integration model. One of the things that our early adopters are helping us with is prioritizing the third parties we integrate with, based on broad market needs within the public libraries of the US. And so we have a prioritized list of content providers, systems providers, hardware providers that we're working through, but automated handling systems is definitely part of that roadmap. Yep. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to the analytics, like CollectionHQ and your product, the library system I'm at, we have over 20 libraries. We have a shared collection. So does this work well with like a shared collection system? Where collections just stay in their individual branches and go back to that individual branch?
So yes, so it's highly configurable. It can support shared collections and floating collections, as well as more traditional dedicated branch level collections. Yep. Some of the recommendations probably don't make so much sense then in a shared or floating collection, of course, and those features just don't have to be activated. Other questions? Well, we do have staff here, and I think there was a call out to stop by the registration desk if you were interested in talking to any staff specifically. I'm here all of today and tomorrow as well. Several of my colleagues you'll see at breaks, lunch, etc. If you do want to ask more direct questions specific to your institution or your concerns, by all means, stop any of us. We're very happy to talk. I want to thank you for your time this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.